The Five Gods, a Melee story told from community to community. If you've ever interfaced with competitive Smash Bros, you've heard the tale. 5 players who held a dominant chokehold on the game for a large amount of time. If one was in attendance, well, you could probably make out the check ahead of time. And if all 5 showed up, you had a 1 in 5 chance of predicting who the winner was. This era was longer than people tend to realize. Most of these players spent their lives playing Melee, upwards of a decade competing at the top level, a narrative so strong even after its end in 2018 due to multiple gods retiring, people still talk about it today. Its influence spread from community to community as people share stories of the time when they were all competing. What if another game had a similar story, though? Smash Ultimate is close enough to Melee, and in 2023 we had a storyline similar brewing. The 4 Horsemen, players who seemed far and beyond the talents of any other player, ushering in the end for Ultimate as a 4-player race. This idea, this narrative that there was such a gap between the 4 best players and the rest of top talent, would quickly burn to the ground. Today, I want to recount the shortly lived era of Ultimate's 4 Horsemen, and ask what happened. Why a narrative that had been built up strong for a solid year was dismantled in a matter of months. Let's take a look at 2 categories that define the 5 gods of Melee, and compare them to how they applied to the 4 Horsemen of Ultimate. Starting off with, probably the most defining aspect of the 5 gods, dominance. From 2009 to 2017, the most agreed upon years in which the 5 gods era took place, there were a total of 72 Smash Majors. This counts things like Genesis, but also invitational styled events like Smash Summit. Out of all 72 Melee events, all but 7 were won by a god of Melee. And it would take until 2015 for the first non-god to win a tournament of this caliber. Oftentimes in hindsight, this period of time is questioned. After all, near the end in 2016 to 2017, players like Plup and Leffen had won events and shown that at their peaks they could compete with the gods. But looking over at the larger scale run of the 5 gods shows that there was truly a distinction to be made. If we break it down from player to player in this group, we get numbers that look like this. Sure, this breakdown makes things seem like there's more 3 gods of Melee than an exact 5, but that's only because I'm being very strict on about what I'm counting the years of the 5 gods era is. Side note about these numbers is also that cutting it off at 2017 instead of partway through 2018 and starting at just 2009 really puts things into perspective. Like Armada, typically seen as the most dominant and consistent of the 5 gods, but he only really overtook the others in the last year of competition. PBMD, who is probably the god that gets the most questions asked about him, is ahead of Mewtwo King, who was so dominant ahead of the gods era you couldn't dare question his status within the group. There's also something to be said about win-loss records against players outside of the top ranks. Armada in this period not losing a set to anyone outside of the top 6 of the game's rankings, but let's save that for another time. Now, let's compare this to Smash Bros. Ultimate. I said this era takes place between 2022 and 2023, but if we look at the sheer amounts of tournaments that took place during that smaller time frame, yeah, it evens out the list of total majors. This is partially due to Ultimate's worldwide appeal that competitive Melee just seemingly lacks, but that's a topic for another day, and for someone else to cover. I'm not too qualified in that. So here we go, from 2022 to 2023, out of the 80 tournaments taking place, the 4 Horsemen of Smash Ultimate, Akola, Sonic, Spargo, and Mia, won 44 major tournaments. Barely above half. This means 36 tournaments were won by other players, ranging from Light, MKLeo, Onin, Shuton, Zachary, etc., etc. If we take a look at this breakdown between the wins of the 4 Horsemen, this leaves us with these numbers. Notably, the most dominant of the 4 Horsemen, Akola, did not win as much as 3 of the 5 gods of Melee, and from there it's only down more and more. This demonstrates that there seems to be a much less of a skill gap, respectively, between both groups and their corresponding games. Don't worry, I don't plan on getting into upset factors or specific runs where players busted out. Mango of the 5 gods is particularly notable for runs where its god status was, seemingly left at home. Rather, we can go over the general idea of upsets in Smash Ultimate and Melee, and why Ultimate seems much more prone to them. You'd think a game as technical and unforgiving as Melee would be upset patient 0, right? 1 frame off that ledge dash and you're 1 stock closer to a loss. But surprisingly, looking at the SSBM rankings the past few years, the same couple players have been alternating spots within the top 10. While there have been a few new top 10 debuts, especially in 2025 with players like Josh Band and SDJ, those players have always been seen in the top 20 range, so we haven't seen the same exponential growth that we've seen in Smash Ultimate. But why is that? You'd think a game with a much lower skill ceiling would be more consistent. What it comes down to is the skill gap in Melee. Especially during the 5 gods era, the difference between the top 5 and the rest of the top 100 was massive. You had Mango styling on hacks, the best non-god, with his pocket falcon. Meanwhile, in Ultimate, top 10 players losing to top 150 or even unranked players is extremely common. The last time a top 10 player lost to an unranked player in Melee, not including locals or regionals, was almost a year and a half ago, with Bing beating Cody Schwab in what was, and arguably still is, the biggest upset in Melee history. Meanwhile, in Ultimate, the last time a top 10 player lost to someone unranked was the last P-tier, with Toon beating Shuton at Supernova only 3 months ago at the time of this script's making. There's only really 2 exceptions to this rule in Melee, 2 players who have risen beyond exponentially, being Nikki and Junebug, and they both have a pretty similar reason: matchup unfamiliarity. This is not to say these two aren't skilled enough to win outside of this unfamiliarity. Rather, it's to show and explain their skill with these characters that we've simply never seen at this level. Never since Wobbling's ban have we seen an Ice Climbers as consistent and punishing as Nikki. Not even Slug was able to get these sort of results. And you've probably seen enough videos about Donkey Kong to know Junebug is a one-of-a-kind top player. These two parallel each other so well, you could make a video about them. But that's not what we're here today for. Have you even looked at the title? For today, they're just outliers. A statistic that falls so far out of our normal calculations that we just sort of push it away. But just because this data isn't being used doesn't mean we can't glean something from it, as it informs us how Ultimate is much more prone to these matchup checks. Having to keep up with 90 different characters, all of whom commit their own special little war crimes, causes some gaps to be left. I think I've got my point across that, over a similar amount of tournaments, the 5 gods of Melee were far more dominant than the 4 Horsemen ever were. And this is being very generous as to what I count as the 4 Horsemen era of Smash Ultimate. I only ever heard this term around the tournament Watch the Throne, and it was as early as February of 2024 that the term would be thrown out as Zomba won Genesis X over 2 of the 4 Horsemen. That covers the first category I wanted to go over in dominance. The second category I wanted to measure these players by was their significance over time to their respective games. So, let's go over it real quick. From 2009 to 2017, that is the era that can roughly be described as the era of the 5 gods. But even this definition isn't concrete. There's no consensus for when the era truly ended. Some would take it in 2017, some would take it earlier to when PPMD retired, others would count the era of 2018 right up to Armada's retirement, and some would take the stance that we're technically still in the era as long as one of the 5 gods is competing. And for the 4 Horsemen, there's less of a defined era because, well, it was so short in reality that I only heard the title for the 4 players around the same time as one single tournament at the end of 2023. I simply counted 2022 because, well, that was the era where a lot of these players were rising up to the top level of competition. The 5 gods of Melee gave a good chunk of their life to the game. Years others would spend working minimum wage jobs, they got the chance to spend that time pushing themselves to the limit against each other. The 4 Horsemen were at the top, at the right place and right time. There's also the fact that if we look at the 5 gods, there's obvious standouts for player favorites, notably Mango seen as the bastion of hype in this era, convincing many rising Melee players to pick up one of 2 space animals. Then there's Armada. While less of a fan favorite than Mango, he still had his own fan base by way of being one of few overseas competitors at top level. He even played a character who was less seen before and after his era of dominance in Peach. And even Hungrybox, seen as the lamest of the 5 gods, held his own fan base in this time. While it wasn't exactly a majority of the viewer base, he piloted Jigglypuff, a character that, outside of him, hasn't won a major tournament since 2010. He was seen as the underdog at points, and to be honest, watching a player congratulate each win he obtained like he does is amazing to watch. Meanwhile, if I compare these fan bases to the 4 Horsemen, you've got Spargo fans. What, did you expect that sentence to continue? To be fair, Spargo's fanbase is similar-ish to Mango's in a way. He's convinced many players to pick up a character which has had middling results outside of him, and both are seen as the hype players of their respective group. It's just that, outside of that, we start to lose the comparisons. Akola, Mia, and Sonic certainly have fans, as any top player does, but it's not to a similar point where their names are used to prove something is possible like the 5 gods were. To put it bluntly, if the 4 Horsemen narrative continued through Ultimate's life, the game would be in a significantly worse place in the eyes of the community than it already is. It's clear that the 4 Horsemen era is nowhere near comparable to the 5 gods of Melee. By 2024, there had been new top players who'd taken out the members, Doramigi, Raru, Hurt, and Shiny Merc, alongside existing top players that showed the skill gap never really got out of hand. 2024 included 16 different major winners in Ultimate, and so far 2025 has had 12. So the 4 Horsemen era faded away as soon as it began. A flash in the pan. Does this mean Ultimate's only potential story at top level is over with? fuck no, where'd you get that idea from? Are you dumb? This just goes to show how, if we truly want to look at Smash Ultimate's ecosystem and find the storylines this game has to show, we can't just expect to rip off from Melee's storylines. Different things happen. They're completely different games with different scenes and different resources at the player's disposal. Instead of looking at where Melee was and trying to replicate that to try to save our game's storylines, we should just take it for what it is. A chaotic swirl of major winners in an era that shows that even when someone's at the top, doesn't mean there's no shot of overtaking them. Good night, and have a happy Halloween. Hey, thank you for making it to the end of the video. Shout out to my channel members Loco Soco, Lumi Luminosity, and Linksicle. You guys are the best. Make sure to like and subscribe and all that stuff you feel like I've earned. And hey, I've been live streaming a lot more, so if you want to tune into those, do so. I don't know, I'm tired. I want to get this video out already, dude.